welcome to Making Worlds Post. My name is Shannon, and I'm a member of the Worker Co-op. Thank you everyone for wearing masks and keeping the community safe. If you haven't already, please register with Punima up at the counter so that in case there's a problem, we can do some contact tracing for everyone. We are honored here today to have some incredibly experienced and thoughtful voices that are going to walk us through what's happening in the occupied territories. I spoke with my comrades in South Africa, where I was born and grew up for the last couple of months, and especially today. And Hassan sends his regards, Susan. He said, give a special shout out. Susan was in South Africa in 2013 or somewhere thereabout, yeah. Predictably, a lot of folks in South Africa who are unhappy with the outcome of the court's opinion participated very vigorously in South Africa in the predictable propaganda campaign to diminish the court's report or the court's opinion, and I'm hoping today we can hear a little bit more about how the rest of the world outside of the US and some Western countries as well as Israel has spun the verdict. Thankfully though, in South Africa there are an incredible amount of activists who obviously from our history of living in an apartheid state have figured out what it's like to contend with this kind of propaganda. And in particular, lots of conversations were happening around the extent to which discussions on how, I guess, the US in particular and its allies along with Israel have continued to ignore a lot of the international decisions and UN resolutions for, gosh, the last 7 decades. As a former journalist, I just looked at the news today, and at least more than 122 journalists have been martyred since October 7th. I'm going to do a quick little introduction of the 3 speakers or 4 speakers, and then I'll hand it over to Nikki and Nada. Just some housekeeping. There's an emergency exit back there, and then up the staircase towards the back, there's another emergency exit. The bathroom is over here, so please feel free to get up and use it if you need to. So I'm just going to start off with Susan Abulhawa. He's a Palestinian American writer and human rights activist. Raz Segal is an associate professor of Holocaust and Genocide at Stockton University, and endowed professor in the study of modern genocide. And Kayla Rothman-Zika is an international human rights lawyer. Okay, well, welcome everyone, and Nikki and Nada.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. It's beautiful to see a packed house, and thank you to all our speakers for being here. My name is Nikki. I'm a writer, and I'm with Philly WAWOG.
I echo Nikki's sentiments and gratitude. Thank you all for coming. My name is Nada. I'm also a creative writer. I'm also a student of communications with the Palestinian Youth Movement and the Philly Palestine Coalition.
We're going to start with some opening remarks. So, Raz, can I just hand it over to you?
Sure. Okay, everyone can hear me? Yes. So thank you so much to the organizers and my fellow panelists and moderators. So I'll just dive into it. The charge of genocide in Gaza that South Africa brought against Israel at the ICJ on 29th of December 2023 sparked the potential, I hope, for unprecedented change. The court ruled that South Africa succeeded in arguing that it is plausible that Israel is perpetrating genocide against Palestinians in Gaza, And that was based on the dozens of explicit statements of, quote, intent to destroy, in the language of the UN Genocide Convention, intent expressed by Israeli state leaders, war cabinet ministers, and senior army officers, and it was also based on the unprecedented levels of killing and destruction. The court then issued 6 provisional measures recognizing the extremely dire situation on the ground. Currently, more than 27,000 Palestinians that the Israeli attack has killed, more than 65,000 wounded, and almost 2 million forcibly displaced and facing famine and the spread of infectious disease. There's also, of course, the widespread destruction of buildings, hospitals, schools, universities, cultural sites, archives, bakeries, and agricultural fields. The provisional measures, as we all know, did not include an order for ceasefire, but they did order Israel, by an overwhelming majority vote of the ICJ of 15-2, to prevent any acts of genocide in Gaza and ensure that its military does not perpetrate such acts. The provisional measures also ordered Israel to prevent and punish incitement to genocide, ensure the provision of urgent aid, prevent the destruction of evidence, and ensure its preservation, and provide the court with a report on these measures within a month. The orders, therefore, and this is, I think, an important point, do in effect request a ceasefire, for there is simply no other way to ensure that the Israeli military does not continue to perpetrate acts of genocide. There's no other way to facilitate the entry and distribution of food, clean water, fuel, medical supplies, and other aid, right? There's simply no other way to do this, so the order is, in effect, actually for a ceasefire. My key point is that the ICJ ruling signals the end of the era of Israeli impunity in the international legal system, and that's really the main thing that I want to focus on. Now, this system, the international legal system, reemerged after World War II with the UN Genocide Convention in December 1948 as its key innovation. The convention and this system was based on the view of Nazism and what we now call the Holocaust, no one used that word then, as exceptional. Now this served a purpose. It separated the Holocaust from the piles of bodies and destroyed cultures that European imperialism and colonialism, which was still very much ongoing at the time, had left around the world in the preceding few centuries. So the Holocaust and Nazism was one thing, colonialism, imperialism, completely separate. Now this secured white supremacy by relativizing its destructive past and present, but it also reflected the ambiguous foundational role of Jews in the Judeo-Christian Western world. Now the Jewish question had indeed stood at the heart of the Nazi worldview. And as historian Alon Confino has argued, the Nazis saw Jews as foundational to the Judeo-Christian world that they wanted to destroy in order to build on its ruins a new Nazi civilization. So reestablishing Jews as foundational in a positive way, right, seemed to make sense in the emergence of an international legal order in response to Nazism. But ambiguity persisted. And on the ground, removed from this kind of ideational framework, Jews very much remained a question and a problem in the eyes of many. The Jewish state that was proclaimed in May 1948 seemed to resolve this tension, because Jews now had a state and was modeled on the European nation state and defined in ethno-national and ethno-religious terms as a Jewish state. The exceptional status of the Holocaust and of Jews in the West rendered the new Jewish state, by implication, also exceptional, especially in the view of the many Holocaust survivors who chose to try to rebuild their lives in Israel. The Holocaust Jews Israel triad of exceptionality, therefore, was immediately significant in blurring the Nakba, the foundational crime of the Israeli state, that is, the mass expulsions of more than 750,000 Palestinians, the massacres and killings of 15,000 Palestinians, and the destruction of hundreds of villages and towns in the 1948 war. Indeed, and this is very important again, the idea that Israel could commit any crime under international law became, in this exceptional framework, right, unimaginable. Impunity for Israel, therefore, was baked into the international legal system from the moment it re-emerged after World War II. The urgent need to blur the Nakba also stemmed from the broader impetus to deny the nature of the Israeli state as a settler colonial project, right? Now this was very paradoxical, of course, because Israel actually reproduced the racism and white supremacy that had targeted Jews for exclusion and ultimately destruction in Europe as a settler colonial project. And it's important to say that actually very, very important Zionist scholars like Anita Shapiro, for example, had described Israel and Zionism as a settler project. And of course, very important Zionists themselves, like Zev Jabotinsky in his kind of text of the Iron Wall in 1923, referred to Zionism as a settler project, right? Now, Israeli, despite this paradoxical situation of reproducing white supremacy in this way, Israeli President Herzog expressed this white supremacy quite explicitly in an interview on MSNBC on 5th of December, and I quote him here. "This war is a war that is not only between Israel and Hamas," he said in response to a question about the mass killing of Palestinians in Israel's attack on Gaza. Now this is already significant actually, because it's actually direct admission that the attack is not only about a struggle against Hamas. He continued and he said it's a war that is intended really truly to save Western civilization. We are attacked by a jihadist network, an empire of evil, and this empire wants to conquer the entire Middle East, and if it weren't for us, Europe would be next, and the United States follows. End of quote. Now Herzog's image of this kind of last stand against the global apocalypse and the demise of, quote, Western civilization reflects a colonial mindset, but one that is taken to extreme, couched within a discourse of religious war that points to the Jewish supremacy at the heart of this white supremacy, in this case of settler colonialism. Now, the concept of genocide functioned to maintain this exceptional status of the Holocaust, Jews in Israel, in the international legal system, the impunity that Israel has, and thus to enable rather than challenge the post-Holocaust reproduction of white supremacy that Herzog expressed so openly. But this is all until now, until the ICJ ruling. Because the court's ruling, which portrays Israel's attack on Gaza as plausibly genocidal, means that now every university, every company, every state around the world will now need to consider very carefully its engagement, its continued engagement, or hopefully not its continued engagement, with Israeli authorities, with Israeli universities, with Israeli companies, as these ties may now constitute perhaps complicity with genocide. So we know, of course, that the Center for Constitutional Rights filed a case in federal court in California on behalf of Palestinian organizations and individuals against President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Austin for failure to abide exactly by the legal obligations of states, according to the Genocide Convention, to prevent genocide in Gaza, and actually for U.S. government complicity with genocide due to the continued U.S. military and diplomatic support of Israel after 8th of October. Now, a few hours after the ICJ ruling on 26th of January, a hearing in that case of the CCR took place in California. Judge Jeffrey S. White allowed Palestinian plaintiffs to testify, both those who live in the U.S. but were born and grew up in Gaza, and those who are now in the West Bank in Gaza. One after the other, they told the court over 3 hours about their family histories during the Nakba. And by the way, I think that the word Nakba was used in that federal court that day more than we have ever heard the word used in U.S. institutions together ever, right? Their own experiences of Israeli mass violence, relatives they have lost after 8th of October, neighborhoods in which they grew up that are no more, schools that Israel's bombings and invasions have turned to rubble, cafes where they will never be able to drink tea again, and feelings of dread and loss. 3 hours of testimony in a U.S. federal court. Dr. Omer Al-Najjar testified via Zoom from the hospital in Rafah, where he now works around the clock with barely any medical supplies. And I quote him, "I've lost everything in this war. I have nothing but my grief. This is what Israel and its supporters have done to us." Ahmed Abu Ful, a Palestinian lawyer working in Al-Haq, described how his grandfather had refused to leave Gaza City in October, even as his relatives told him that they would later return. And he quotes his grandfather here, "This is exactly what they told me in 1948. His grandfather responded, having survived the Nakba but never been able to return to where he grew up. Now, while Judge White decided on 31st of January, as we know, to dismiss the case on jurisdictional grounds because he said that the court could not, in his view, interfere in government decision-making related to foreign policy, he nevertheless issued an another unprecedented ruling, stating, quote, that both the controverted testimony of the plaintiffs and the expert opinion proffered at the hearings of these motions, as well as statements made by various officers of the Israeli government, indicate that the ongoing military siege in Gaza is intended to eradicate a whole people, and therefore plausibly falls within the international prohibition against genocide. As the ICJ has found, the judge continued, it is plausible that Israel's conduct amounts to genocide. And therefore, he said, the court implores defendants Biden, Blinken, and Austin to examine the results of their unflagging support of the military siege against the Palestinians in Gaza. Right? This is a federal court in the US, right? So another unprecedented ruling. All this, I think, I hope, and I plan to do whatever I can to realize this, is already having an effect. Now, I mentioned here just 3 examples very briefly. One, we heard yesterday, maybe you've heard of a statement of over 800 serving officials in the US and UK government stating that their government's policies on the Israel-Gaza war could amount to grave violations of international law, war crimes, and even ethnic cleansing or genocide. And they referred specifically to the ICJ ruling and concerns now about complicity. So 800 serving officials. In a different yet related realm, the Faculty Senate at the University of Michigan passed a resolution on 29th of January calling on the university to divest from companies involved in Israel's assault on Gaza. It's very far from a more comprehensive BDS resolution, but I think we'll see much more of this in the academic world moving forward. And a few days ago, Spain, the government of Spain decided to give the ICC, the International Criminal Court, across the street from the ICJ in The Hague, €500,000 in order to allow it to move forward its investigations of war crimes in Gaza, because the prosecutor rightly actually always argues that he doesn't have enough money. Now, as it happens, the court in California and the public heard the testimonies of Palestinians about the Nakba and about genocide in Gaza one day before the International Holocaust Memorial Day, on 27th of January, which marks the day in 1945 when Soviet forces liberated the Nazi annihilation camp at Auschwitz. This memory culture, global Holocaust memory, which is imagined since the fall of the Soviet Union as a global memory culture, despite its rhetoric about the voices of the victims and survivors, this memory culture is actually state-centered, and it is managed within a system of powerful state institutes, such as the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum here in DC, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, and the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. It is furthermore this state system that has repeatedly weaponized Holocaust memory against those facing state violence, including Palestinians, that Israel and its supporters in the West, primarily here in the US and in Germany, have portrayed since 7th of October as Nazis. Now, 2 more minutes. Netanyahu referred to Hamas as Nazis a number of times since 7th of October, but as recently as a speech on 13th of January, where he promised Israelis to continue the attack on Gaza no matter the Hague. He told his Israeli audience that Israeli soldiers had found in Gaza a tablet of a little girl with a photo of Hitler as its screensaver. Now, no evidence of such a thing has surfaced anywhere, not even in the Israeli media. And anyone who follows the Israeli media has been exposed in the last few months to really shocking things. But not even there. But now, this image that Netanyahu included is lodged firmly in the minds of many Israelis, a little girl with a tablet with Hitler's screensaver. And the way in which this image portrays all Palestinians in Gaza as Nazis, even children, is clear, and it is very genocidal. This is especially in the context of an attack in which Israel has killed now over 10,000 children. To complete the picture of a world turned upside down, Netanyahu also said in that speech that it is outrageous to accuse Israel, the state that emerged from the Holocaust, of perpetrating genocide. Impunity, right? But such utterances, and again this is a key point, do not work anymore after 7th of October as they had worked previously. As we enter a new era of international law, I hope, past decades of impunity for Israel, with the crime of genocide now used finally to support the struggle to stop Israel's genocidal assault on Palestinians and hold Israeli leaders, politicians, army officers, and journalists accountable, it is the voices of Palestinians, such as the testimonies we heard in federal court here in California. These voices point also to a new era of Holocaust memory, an era past the denial of the Nakba through the Holocaust and the silencing of Palestinians through the Holocaust. Indeed, it's based on a new global focus on the Holocaust, right? So that the ICJ ruling, together with the CCR case, also open, I hope, new opportunities for a world that will finally put the voices, knowledge, histories, and the perspectives of people who face state violence front and center in Palestine and around the world.
Thank you. And we'll hear from Kayla next. Or
Oh no. Okay. Sorry, I thought we were going down, so I closed my notebook. Can everyone hear me? Thank you, Raz. My name is Kayla. I work in international human rights. I work for an organization called Lex Collective. We're a collective of public interest and human rights law firms around the world. We like to think about it as sort of movement lawyering on a global scale, where we work with communities, lawyers from those communities, where atrocities have happened. We're talking about war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, human trafficking, and other crimes. Once we do investigation, documentation in those particular areas, we then map out accountability avenues. I'm telling you this because I want to contextualize how we understand the ICJ ruling. Accountability we define quite broadly. This can be a day in court where you hear 3 hours of testimony regardless of the outcome. That is still something very significant. It can be compensation, which means that, which jurisdiction is the one that can get actual compensation to the victims. It can be a ruling that there's plausibility of genocide, or it can be an accurate historical record, which is also what many communities ask for and we work for always. I say this to sort of contextualize how we strategize around accountability and how we use international mechanisms and domestic mechanisms to achieve the accountability that the communities, impacted countries, particular war zones are looking for. Raj just gave a great sort of history of sort of how we got to where we are today, and I'll just add to that. Post World War II, the international community sort of coalesced around a shared vision of how do we make sure this never happens again, right? And we wrote a bunch of laws and conventions. We wrote the UN Charter. We wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We wrote the Geneva Conventions. We wrote the Genocide Convention. The idea being sort of we need a standard. We need a standard of how we treat human beings, and we need everyone to buy into that standard, and we need everyone to keep that standard up. we are now in 2024, and we didn't succeed. Those conventions, these rules, the ICJ was also something we created as the World Court at that time to really sort of keep this standard alive and keep it going and have sort of a consensus around it. And we can look over the past, 70 years, and atrocities happen at a rate and complexity that truly was not imagined in between the years of 1945 and 1951, when a lot of this took place. Between the internet, between how much money can move and how fast it can move, between climate change, migration, all of these things, between weapons of mass destruction, we were really looking at a much more complicated situation as far as how do we actually understand accountability for atrocities, and how do we need to look at that. I want to just give an example, and all this will make sense as to why I'm giving you all of this background. But I work specifically in the context of Sudan, and when we think about the genocide in Darfur, right? We think about war crimes, right? We think about this. I like to think about it as sort of a dartboard, right? We think about the war crime that happened on the ground, the soldier killing X number of people, right? And in sort of the decades around accountability around the genocide in Darfur, we hear a lot of business and human rights, corporate accountability, right? We think about the dartboard, like what's the one ring out? Okay, there's corporations that are involved in genocide, right? There are corporations that manufacture guns, that manufacture tanks, that get that there. And then we look at one dart, I don't know what the word is, but the circle right outside of that, and you look at the financial institutions, because what bank was moving money for the Sudanese army that basically made that genocide possible? My organization, we represent victims of the genocide in Darfur against BNP Bank, because that was the bank that moved over just 2 years $6 billion during the genocide. And so it's just to sort of contextualize who is accountable, and a multi-pronged strategy is always necessary in the sort of the complexity of the world that we live in today. Raz gave sort of an overview of what happened at the ICJ. I won't repeat that. I think that the preliminary measures that came down. Briefly, I'm sure everyone in here knows, because we've been all following this. The ICJ is a court that solves disputes between countries. It is not a criminal court, nor does it have any enforcement mechanism. So it's really just, again, right, that standard, right? What is the standard of human rights, and who is violating it, and how can we sort of solve that within a court? The preliminary, just to reiterate, I think the preliminary measures that were given, the refrain from genocidal acts, to ensure that the military refrains from those acts, to prevent and punish incitement, the humanitarian aid, and the preserving evidence, lawyer evidence, like to preserve evidence, so important, and to submit a report within a month. There is something really important about a lot of these are cannot be enforced without a ceasefire, and I think even in the reading of the decision, that was actually mentioned later on, after the preliminary, likely a ceasefire is required in order to enforce these preliminary measures. But I think that in terms strategically, had the court said there needs to be a ceasefire, and then Israel just violated that order immediately, I don't know if there was any type of strategy involved, but I'm curious when asking Israel to then submit a report, which is very similar to the Gambia versus Myanmar, another case that the ICJ held, and to be accountable, sort of like tell us exactly how you've been upholding these preliminary measures, which we have given you, and we want details, and we want exactly know how you've made humanitarian aid better, how you have preserved evidence, how you have punished incitement from your public officials, which has continued relentlessly, and how you're not continuing to conduct genocide inside Gaza. So I think it's curious what will happen. I don't know if that was a particular strategy on the court's part, but I do think it's worth watching. I think the other three things that I mentioned. A ceasefire is required. The plausibility of a genocide is huge. It's a really big deal to have the court say that. It's likely will have many ripple effects, I think, and also the fact that Palestine is recognized as a distinct group worthy of protection under Article 2 of the Convention is also a really big deal because that had, in my opinion, but it's this has been a debate. What is Palestine in the international community? All of these things, and I think that the definition in the Genocide Convention is that it's when you're trying to destroy in whole or in part a protected group, right? Whether it's through race, religion, nationality, and the court is recognizing that Palestine falls within a protected group, and that's also something to acknowledge, and that's useful. That's really useful. Again, I don't want to repeat anything that Raz already said. The CCR case, the Center for Constitutional Rights, there have been a few different efforts. There's also one in the UK. There's also in different places in Europe on utilizing where genocide falls into domestic legislation, and then being able to take it to court. So CCR used the failure to prevent genocide in U.S. law, and I really think the fact that the judge said, and quote, is that in rare cases the preferred outcome is inaccessible to the court, and this is one of those cases. To be able to acknowledge that he would have preferred to rule, in favor of this case, and he could not for jurisdictional reasons because the court couldn't interfere with foreign affairs. Again, it's significant, and I've worked with some people at CCR, and one in particular said recently, similarly, the fact that the Nakba was discussed at length, also to provide the context, to give the history, but also to explain why calling for another Nakba is incitement to genocide, is also a significant moment that I think is again really useful. And I say all of this because when we look at strategies around accountability, all of this is useful. Sort of how the ICJ will trickle down, how this case with CCR, what that judge said. We're not losing all the time. And I'll wrap up and hand it over to Susan, because I think the divestment from Michigan, the University of Michigan, is significant, but also because I'm obsessed with the money that enables atrocities. The the U.S. Department of Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network this week sent an alert to every single U.S. bank, an alert on Israeli extremist settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. And I cannot tell you how big of a deal that is. And also, the White House issued an executive order on sanctions against, and I will quote this because I think it's a big deal. Basically, the executive order granting the grounds to sanction anyone his administration deems a threat to the West Bank's peace, stability, and security. And it's not, and again, sanctions is one tactic in accountability. It's not, when you sanction an individual, it's not, I've done this quite a bit in the context of Ukraine and Russia over the past 2 years. Getting someone on a list of sanctioned individuals is not, the success or anything like that. But what it does is it triggers sanctions violations. And then you have openings for accountability, you have openings for litigation. And again, when you're thinking about accountability, you're thinking about compensation, you're thinking about holding financial institutions accountable, you're thinking about holding corporations accountable, in addition to holding governments and states and military accountable. But these are all sort of multi-pronged approaches to actually thinking about this holistically, utilizing every possible mechanism available, because there's just how the world works today. It's too complicated to focus on sort of one place at one time when you're thinking about the massive amounts of weapons required to do what Israel is doing in Gaza right now, the massive amounts of money required. And it is obviously through, a lot coming from the US government, but also sort of what banks are enabling that, what companies are enabling that. So I just will end there. I will say, in sort of preparing for this, I have not been optimistic at all about the situation, but I think a lot has actually happened in the past 7 days, and it's not. I didn't have a particular different expectation from the ICJ. I expected that to happen the way it happened, but the things that happened after that, I think, are really interesting and worth noting. And I think there's movement, and movement is important. And especially, I think people in this room who are parts of movements, there really, I think, is an opportunity right now. Where people are listening and people have learned a lot, this really opens up, I think, a wide range of options.
Thank you both. I'm the slacker in the room who didn't prepare something before coming, so I'm happy that I get to feed off of my co-panelists. I really appreciate the summary from Raz and then the further analysis from you. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a legal scholar, and I'm not a scholar of genocide studies or any other relevant studies to the issue at hand. So I'm going to speak to you as a Palestinian and a person who is involved and has been involved in several U.S. lawsuits against Zionist organizations in the United States. So in general, I've never really had much faith in international law, because it has always seemed to me that it is a system that has been, if not set up to serve Western interests, it in effect has been utilized to serve Western interests. No Western war criminal, and there are so many of them, has ever been held accountable through international law. It has primarily served to bring Black and brown leaders to accountability, to invade countries under pretexts of WMDs and whatnot. So when South Africa filed the lawsuit, I didn't have a whole lot of hope, but I was nonetheless, really happy that they did that, because I do think that the courts here, internationally and globally, do represent a strategy, a tool in a larger struggle. And when the ruling was announced, my first reaction was outrage that there was that they didn't call for a ceasefire. And, I just thought, oh, here we go. This is not surprising. They are, they basically are parroting what the United States has been saying. Oh, we're calling on Israel to stop killing Palestinians and to avoid civilian deaths, etc. But keep going, keep bombing. That's how I initially interpreted it. One of the first responses I heard in reaction to the ruling was from actually a couple from Palestinians in Gaza who had the same reaction. And of course, their immediate concern is to stop the bombing. And in the absence of that, the ruling was worthless to them. And the next reaction was actually from an Israeli politician, and I wish I wrote her name down. But she effectively said this. She said, well, the ICJ doesn't have any teeth. What happens is they will, if they find that Israel is in violation, they will refer it to the Security Council, and we have a promise from the US to veto anything. So in effect, we get to do whatever the hell we want. And as my co-panelists have mentioned, they did, even prior to the ruling, Netanyahu and others in his cabinet and his government did say, they were very defiant. They said, regardless, Haig Schmeig or whatever Ben Gvir said, that, we're going to do what we want to do. And indeed, right after the ruling, they actually intensified the killing. I think the day after, they murdered upwards of 500, and then the day after that, even more. And they continued, and they escalated for a few days. And then on the heels of that, of course, the United States, Britain, and all these other Western countries decided to defund UNRWA, which is the only UN agency that has been tasked with keeping Palestinians alive. So that, to take away funding from the principal source of nutrition and shelter from people who are already starving and who are thirsty and for whom disease is spreading and malnutrition. And it just, so it was this sort of, it was the empire's, just sort of defiance, like, this global south isn't going to mess with us. We're still the big dogs in the room, and we're going to do whatever the hell we want. And to me, that's what that said. Well, that's what that signified. Because it was a response, because, let me backtrack a little bit. So those are my immediate sort of responses and the reactions that I heard and read. I immediately called, but not being a lawyer, I realized that I don't understand a lot of the legal implications. So I immediately called Deanna Buktu, and she explained, she says, no, Susie, this is amazing. And her words were, on a scale of 1 to 10, this is an 11. So, and she actually said to me exactly what you said, is that this signifies the end of Israel's impunity. And she went on to explain to me some legal mechanism that I'm sure I still don't really understand, but that the court could not rule for ceasefire. It was not within its purview. And that South Africa really had erred in actually requesting that. But in effect, as Raz said, the ruling was a de facto ruling for ceasefire. And so I did change my mind. I changed my mind immediately, and because I trust Diana, and then I started to read other legal analyses that that gave me a little bit more hope. And in my mind, the way I see it now as a non-legal person is a rebellion of the global South using these very systems that have been used against them, sort of entering them, occupying them, and using them against this sort of global North Empire. That's how it works, and that's how I see this. And this sort of image began to solidify as other nations in the global South began to show support for South Africa's case, and also when I think it's Chile and Mexico who declared that they are going to pursue a separate case against Israel. So, this was, this feels really hopeful to me. However, that Israeli minister or politician is correct. The ICJ does not effectively have teeth. But it does sort of, in addition to this sort of psychological lifting of this sense of hopelessness and defeatism that I think a lot of us in the global South feel, this powerlessness that we feel, I think it did help lift some of that. But it opens a massive avenue for lawyers all over the world to begin filing lawsuits against the corporations that you mentioned, against the funders, against all of these corporations who have been complicit, who have even expressed support for Israel. We already have seen this incredible grassroots movement against companies like Starbucks and McDonald's bear pretty significant fruit. Starbucks is spiraling down the tube right now. They even have like watermelon mugs and stuff trying to redeem themselves,
Lord.
And it's especially pronounced in the Middle East, where Arab populations who unlike their governments are firmly planted on the side of Palestinians and are doing what they can to help. Part of that is the boycott, and I think this ICJ ruling really helps to bolster our drive. Now, that said, I think no revolution in history, no real moral change ever happened because of what leaders did or even court rulings. It happened because of the pressure that we as collectives, as people, put to drive these things and then to implement them. And I think this has to be said over and over, because we cannot depend on the ruling. We should see this ruling as and even the ruling and what Judge White said in the CCR case, these are tools for us. This is not something that we need to just sit back and look at and wait for something to happen, because it will not happen without us. And I see that as my work, as part of my work, as part of all of our work to continue to push in every way that we can. And I really do hope that lawyers around the world, and especially in this country, will be galvanized to file more lawsuits. So now going back to the lawsuits I mentioned that I'm a part of in this country, these were filed back in 2018. The first one was Abulhawa versus the United States Treasury. And it was basically to compel the IRS to investigate all of these Zionist organizations who are funding illegal settlements, who are funding the IDF, who are funding organizations and individuals who are causing tremendous harm. However, we lost that and it got thrown out. The other two, one was called Abulhawa versus Friends of Beit El, but I got pulled out of that suit, and now it's called Taled versus Friends of Beit El. And then there's another one that's a bigger lawsuit. It's called Tamimi, as in Bassem Tamimi, that you all know, Ahed's father, versus Adelson, Sheldon Adelson. And so the purpose of these lawsuits was to sue these Zionist organizations in the United States who are fundraising and sending money, tax-exempt money from our tax base to fund genocide, essentially, and ethnic cleansing and illegal settlement building and profound harm to Palestinians. So initially, the Tamimi case was dismissed on the grounds of what's called the political question, that this all fell within the purview of the executive branch, and it's not, the court lacks jurisdiction. However, that decision was reversed on appeal, and it's still in the process now. So we're still going forward. And we had a meeting the other day, and I don't know, it's still not clear what the effect of these rulings will be, but they don't hurt, right? Because it's the other thing that these rulings are doing is putting a new language, they're putting new concepts in popular imagination that previously saw Israel as only this safe haven for a tortured and historically persecuted people, for the eternal victims, and also as the best friend of the United States, surrounded by all of these dark savages who just want to annihilate them, who get up in the morning, drink their coffee, and think about nothing but killing Jews. This is what the situation is like in the imaginary of most American people. And I think what's happening now is a seismic shift, is just a complete disruption of this fairy tale that people in this country and beyond have been nursing on for decades. Yeah, so, I mean, I don't know how long I've been talking, but maybe I should just stop but I mean, yeah, that's, as a Palestinian, this is an immensely painful moment, and it is also simultaneously an immensely hopeful moment. It is almost, it's difficult to reconcile this, this eruption of emotions that are near constant daily. I can't help but scroll, and there's, in part because I feel like, even though it's harmful on some level, because it's not good to live in this constant state of rage and anger and sadness and impotence. But I do it because I feel like these people who are being murdered constantly in the most gruesome ways, live streamed to the whole world, I should at least bear witness to that. And it's the least I can do that so many people don't die in obscurity, in the darkness, in silence. And at this hour, it has become, I feel like for the rest of my life, what I do in everything I do will be to address this moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Is this good? Hello? Test? I'm just going to project. I can, sure. Thank you. Thank you, Susan, for naming that. Is it on? It's on. Thank you for naming that at the end. I feel the exact same, that nothing will ever be the same, and that's not just like the way that I'm feeling, but it's also a promise of how to engage with the world around us. I'll admit that when I first heard the hearing or the order, felt similar to how you felt in the beginning of just like rage. And I understand that like the ICJ can't actually call for a ceasefire, but especially when it comes to Israel, I am very skeptical about the law, precisely because Israel creates legal exceptions constantly for itself and how it operates. And so part of my question is about the word genocidal act, because my first understanding was that it could create a sort of loophole that Israel could say, we're using surgical strikes now instead of dumb bombs, and that we are in that way not engaging in genocide, but the entire condition of living in Gaza is genocidal by nature. And also then with forces of slow violence, so even if Israel didn't drop a single bomb, no food, no water, people are dying of disease, of starvation. I wonder like what this ruling means in that sense of what a genocidal act actually represents in this case and how it can actually extrapolate to the conditions in Gaza. If anybody has any.
Yeah, I'm happy to give it a first pass. So the acts, according to the definition, and I think you probably have the definition written down, but it's killing, it's physical violence, it's limiting reproductive ability, it's destroying infrastructure that enables living in any kind of way. The thing about proving genocide, which is a very difficult thing to prove, because it has to be entirely conclusive that there is intent, and the intent is there, and there's no maybes in there. So it's actually, and I mean, it's actually a very interesting history of the word genocide and that versus what a crime against humanity is. And tactically, I will just say that I always go for a crime against humanity as opposed to genocide, because genocide is so impossible to prove. And the difference, and they were actually both terms that came up during the Nuremberg tribunals in terms of trying to define what had just happened. And the difference is, genocide has the intent to destroy, whole or in part, a protected group, whereas a crime against humanity is the systematic, widespread nature and killing of people. And it does not, you do not have to prove intent in that circumstance. However, it's not a convention. There's no convention that has a crime against humanity in it, so it's not applicable to the ICJ. We take those kinds of cases to the ICC, and people will 100% in this case. But I will just say, as far as Israel, I'm assuming is going to say a lot of things as far as how they're going to explain what they're doing. I think that and also just to add, because we're for preliminary measures, the evidence, the threshold of evidence is very low. It's just on first glance, if this looks like potential genocide, then we can issue these preliminary measures. But it's going to be a long legal battle to actually prove that genocide took place. And there's a lot out there just because of the amount of statements. That's usually, you can infer intent from statements, and that I'm just like, that nexus is the most important part, right? Sort of what they actually do on the ground, but it is one thing, but what they're actually saying that they're doing is the thing that is used to prove genocide. And I think that's what it's going to come down to at the end. But would you like to add?
So, a number of things that I'm thinking in response to the question. I mean, first of all, to emphasize again, I think that what we're seeing is that, in the international legal system, right, the ICJ was never supposed to sit, right, in discussion of a case of genocide against Israel, right? But that was never, this is like an accident of the system, right? So that's already, very, very significant, right? The system is not doing what it was supposed to. It's actually now kind of stabbing itself, right, or something like this, right? So that's we're already in a process that actually, could create maybe even potentially change international law in some way. I don't, and of course, it's important to say that part of this is because the intent in this case is expressed, and the court, the ICJ actually quoted statements of intent in its ruling. Now, and why do we have these explicit, direct, and unashamed statements of intent? Because of the imagination of Israelis that they're actually fighting a colonial war against savages, right? And this actually is important because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, this goes to the heart of the origins of international law that is actually meant to regulate wars between, quote, civilized nations, that is, Europeans, which was never supposed to be applicable in any case to wars against the colonized, wars in the colonial world, because these are indeed savages. And we can think about the Herero and Nama genocide, of course, in German Southwest Africa, where in response to rebellion by the Herero, the German occupiers, of course, conducted genocidal warfare and destroyed almost the entire Herero population at the time, 65,000 people and 10,000 Nama. But this is why I think we're seeing this explicit, direct, and unashamed expressions of intent, right? And that's what caused the accident, right? Genocide is so difficult to prove because of the issue of intent. Now we have this unashamed, including in so many mechanisms also, right? Religious language, or just the description of the entire Palestinian population in Gaza as enemies, and a lot of dehumanizing language, of course, monsters, human animals, so on, as Nazis. That is, we also recognize historically as genocidal, of course, right? So the colonial mindset, which is the origins of the international legal system, is also what drives this accident, right, quote unquote, of the International Court of Justice now. So I think, moving forward, right, I think it's a watershed moment, right? And I agree with everything that was said, that, it depends on this intersections of law and politics, right, to drive this forward in various ways. So that's one thing that I wanted to say. Another thing is that actually, and this is, of course, the case will go on for years, as we know, right, until a final ruling. But and again, correct me if I'm getting any of this wrong, but my understanding of the hearings is that one of the key issues that the South African team brought up was this weaponization that Israel has been using for a long time of international humanitarian law by saying, we are warning the population, right? And so this is actually a humanitarian act, right? We've also told, I mean, it's not forced displacement as a crime. We're actually saying, you know, this is a dangerous war zone. Our fight is against Hamas. You have to leave, right? So this kind of very typical weaponization of international humanitarian law that Israel has used for a long time. Now, however, because of the crime of genocide, right, again, a big accident. Why? And this is what the South African team actually argued. They said, no, or I don't know if they said it this way, but this is, I think, the implication. Israel's evacuation order, starting from the first one on 13th of October, right, are actually themselves already genocidal because they're conducted, right, under bombings that also target the safe routes, right? And we know even the New York Times published a big investigative piece on the fact that Israel used its US manufactured strongest bombs, right, the 2,000-pound bombs, in the south where it ordered people to flee. And we know, because there are, of course, text messages and voice messages of Palestinians from Gaza who, in those days, right, those who chose to flee, right, in some cases experienced this intense bombings, these incredibly dangerous, that they fled back to the north, right? They thought that there's more chances for them to survive in the north than actually in the south, right? And then, of course, the South African team also said that not only the bombings, but then, of course, the total siege, right? The explicit proclamation of total siege. And we know, because Gaza, of course, was under siege for 16 years before, right? Which is, again, the longest siege in modern history, right? But we know that by 13th of October, people in Gaza were already very much feeling the effects of the total siege, right? Of the lack of food, clean water, fuel, medical supplies. So the argument was that this is not at all actually a humanitarian measure, but it actually fits exactly in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, the definition of genocide, the third act, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part. And how do we know this? Because today, as you said, we have conditions of we already have famine, and experts around the world are talking about the conditions of famine, the conditions of the spread of infectious disease, and we know that if this continues, hundreds of thousands of people might die of these conditions, which are already genocidal, as you mentioned, Nikki. So I think that this actually, and it is just a preliminary ruling, and there's a lot that could happen, but we already see in this ruling, at least, and this is my interpretation, right, very important indication, right, that it will be very difficult for Israel actually, and the court actually. The Israeli team actually presented the weaponization of the international humanitarian law, right, argument in the court, and the court effectively rejected it in this preliminary ruling, right. So I think it is indeed, I think, a watershed moment, this accident of international law.
So I actually, in my conversation with Diana Buttu, I asked her that exact question, and she basically said it doesn't matter, and I can't remember the rest of that. But she kind of explained something in legal terms, which kind of goes over my head, and I forget it. But the bottom line is, according to her, it doesn't really matter. What I have seen on social media are a lot of just the other day there was an Israeli ad of a woman talking about how much aid they're allowing in, how much they care, how their war is only with Hamas, they care about the civilians, blah, blah. On the other hand, after the ruling, there was this massive colonization conference in which Ben Gvir, Daniela Weiss, and a whole bunch of other settler movements were laying out their plans to colonize Gaza and how they're going to get rid of Palestinians and how to effectively weaponize hunger and thirst to make them look pitiful and get other countries to take them, etc. I think Israel is maybe worried on the one hand. On the other hand, they are, my sense is that, like all colonizers, they're kind of drunk on their power, and there's a profound arrogance that goes with that, and part of that arrogance is a complete underestimation of the agency of the people they colonize. They have always underestimated us. They have always underestimated our attachment to the land, our immovability from the land, our persistence in advocating for ourselves and for return, our ability to prioritize education and create institutions and universities of education. And it's no accident that they're literally bombing, and this isn't the first time they've bombed and targeted universities and schools. I mean, they've done that throughout the West Bank. They have confiscated, in 2002, they stole all student records from, K through 12 university. They stole all those records in 2002 under Ariel Sharon. And because, in my view, in their mind, our function in the world is to be a cheap labor source for them, that is ignorized, that lives in abject poverty, and we're there to serve. Like, that's, to me, and Raz, if I'm wrong, you can correct me, but I think in the popular imaginary among Israelis, among colonizers in general throughout history, this is how they conceive of Palestinians. So, of course, they were shocked at the ingenuity of the tunnels and how much Hamas was able to accomplish. Of course, they're shocked by the stubbornness and the fact that 400,000 people have refused to leave the north still, despite this horrendous bombardment. If Israel is going to say that, yeah, we're dropping leaflets and we're trying to avoid, civilian casualties, etc., given the actual casualties of children, of women, of clear non-combatants, elderly, fathers, brothers, young people, infirm, would indicate either one, they have the most incompetent army that the world has ever known, or they're doing it intentionally. Like, it's hard to escape one or the other. And frankly, and again, I mean, I still don't have a whole lot of stock in international law, and I'm not hanging my hat on it. And I do understand that this is going to be adjudicated over the span of years before we have a definitive answer from the court. And quite frankly, given everything we have seen, given the intentionality, not just from leaders, but from soldiers, from commanders, from the top to the bottom, given their language, the glee, this is something that is still really shocking to me as a human being, is the glee that ordinary Israelis feel seeing what they're seeing. Now, I mean, during the Jewish Holocaust, a lot of Germans said we didn't know. And that's plausible, right? Because there was no internet, there was no social media, and it was maybe hidden from, I don't know, you're the scholar, maybe you can speak more to that, I don't know. But Israelis cannot say they did not know. Everybody knows. And it is shocking. It really is something that I still cannot comprehend. And I've tried to imagine myself in a situation where I see Israelis being slaughtered. And there's nothing in my being that could accept that. There's nothing in my being that would be happy about seeing children buried alive, literally being buried alive. Their last moments of life being utter terror for, it takes about 10 to 15 minutes to die of asphyxiation under the dirt. And that's how tens of thousands of people, most of them children, have died. And that's important to say. And to see that and to want more is something that I think everybody needs to contemplate and think about. Who does that? What kind of pathological mindset is this? And I think this needs to be taken into account in this legal venue, whether or not it's relevant or not is not in a court is something I don't know, but in what we do and how we react, I think this is something we really need to think about. And because when apartheid ended in South Africa, it didn't end because they just woke up one day and had a conscience and said, hey, shit, what we're doing is wrong and we need to fix this. No, they stopped. They had to stop. They were compelled to end this horrible, brutal, corrupt, unjust system because we demanded it, because the world said, you're not welcome here. And it became too expensive. It became too isolating. It became too psychologically, difficult for this white supremacist system to continue to exist in the world. And that's what we as people need to do. And it shouldn't stop with Palestine. This is the most acute case that I think we have ever seen. In the speed of murder, in the gruesomeness of it, is something we've not seen in history before. But that doesn't mean that horrors aren't happening today. And one of the examples that always comes up is what's happening in Congo. And I think we, when I said a rebellion of the global South, I mean it. I feel that, and this is where the hope I mentioned comes from. It comes, we really have a moment. We have the tools, we have the energy, we have the momentum to push a new world order, to really and truly fight for the world we all want. And it starts in Gaza. This is where it starts. And it is not an exaggeration in my mind to say that the outcome of this moment, and I've said this before, will determine the path of humanity for many generations to come. If we cannot triumph in Gaza, if we cannot come together as the masses of the world and make this stop, if we can't continue to divest, insist the universities divest, if we cannot continue to boycott, to be in the streets, to go on hunger strikes, to stand in front of the White House, to get these monsters out of office, if we cannot do this, then we are affirming this world order where the powerful get to do whatever the fuck they want and we are slaves to it. But we can, and this is our moment to change this narrative that we have all been forced to live under. Thank you. Sorry I cursed. It just came out.
I think it's better that we just use one rather than keep shifting, but I think that's a perfect, actually before I ask that question, in tandem with being in the streets, I think in about 30 minutes we will be in the streets, so stay tuned for that. But I think, just to get a bit more specific about the ways that we in our different arenas can actually use these cases as precedent and as kind of momentum for the work we do, whether it's as professors or students in academia or lawyers challenging international law or even writers. I mean, there's a lot of from what I see, strategic opportunities that these cases provide for organizers. I just want to know what you guys think those strategic opportunities might look like, and even what precedents this might set for atrocities that are also ongoing right now as we speak. I mean, could you know, people that are advocating for Congo or Haiti or other, you know, colonized places look at what is happening now in Gaza and pull from that in order to level their own struggle?
Do you want to keep going?
Sure. I mean, I kind of already, you know, answered that, so I'll just be very brief and just say that I think Israel is Israel in its current form as an apartheid state that promulgates Jewish supremacy at the expense of the indigenous non-Jewish population is literally the linchpin in this colonial world order. And that's why I think it is it's imperative that we triumph. And triumph doesn't necessarily just mean getting a positive ruling from the ICJ. You know, it means the incremental marginalization and isolation of Israel so that their system of supremacy becomes too expensive. It becomes too costly for them. Or did you want? Sorry, it's my right hand.
Okay. So avenues for action. I mean, I'm thinking I teach in a university. So avenues for action include a number of things in that framework. One is I think this is a moment on the basis of the ICJ ruling also to get Israeli universities to cut ties officially, American universities to cut ties officially with Israeli universities. And this is on the concrete basis of the deep involvement for years of Israeli universities with oppression, with occupation, with siege, with mass violence. So I think this effort that has been ongoing for a long time, but has not been very successful. I think now there's an opportunity to move that forward, and hopefully we'll see a lot of those kinds of initiatives. The other, of course, is I think, as I said, I think that in the federal court in California we heard the word Nakba. I mean, we are beyond, this is the end of Israel's impunity. It's also, I think, the end of Nakba denial. And this is so very important when we think about a university where Palestinian has been silenced, where Palestinian history has been denied, described as a sensitive issue, as all these kinds of ways of not teaching about this, or not talking about this, or not actually addressing, I mean, just the simple documented historical truth, right? So in a university, which is so important, right, to insist, this is very old school historian of me, right? This is very just to focus on the truth, right? So I think we need to push that forward, right? I actually, in a way, I talked about global Holocaust memory, right? And I'm a historian of Jewish history, actually, originally of the Jewish world, and historian of the Holocaust. And I think we're also entering, in a way, an era of global Nakba memory, perhaps, in some ways, right? So that's another. And one last thing that I'll just say briefly in terms of avenues of action is that this opens a window to try to enhance the struggle to protect Palestinians everywhere under Israel's rule and occupation. And we know that the Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem have been facing an intensifying ethnic cleansing campaign after 7th of October. In any case, every year in the last several years, right, was the most brutal and deadly year for Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. We know that Palestinian citizens of Israel have been facing a concerted attack against them after 7th of October in various ways. All this also requires action to actually prevent, right? So because when we think about genocide, specifically the crime of genocide, so prevent the further intensification, escalation of Israeli violence in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem and within Israel itself, especially when we think about the context of incitement to genocide, right, which is so severe in Israeli media and politics and public spaces, which means that a lot of Israelis now actually see Palestinian citizens of Israel, as in a way the most dangerous, the enemy within, right? So similar, if you want to think historically, to the situation of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire during World War I, who faced genocide as accomplices with the enemy, with the Russian enemy, in the imagination of Ottoman authorities, right? So there's that avenue. I think that is also very important.
If I can just add briefly, I'm going to talk about something I don't know much about, which is always a good start, but I'm just going to throw it out there, and I think it's something really worthwhile, and maybe more people in this room know more about it. But last summer, I can say last summer, it's January now, last summer I facilitated a workshop in Brussels with a lot of Palestinian civil society organizations, including Al-Haq, Who Profits, also European, ELSC, Defense for Children International, all these organizations, we came together to sort of think about accountability strategies, specifically around money that goes in and out of occupied Palestinian territories. And a real sense of defeat was in the room because of things like Morningstar. Does everyone know about Morningstar? It's how investors see whether or not companies have a red flag as far as investing in them. And because of anti-BDS legislation in the United States and Morningstar's ability to take off red flags of all Israeli companies in the West Bank, which was a highly politicized move, but it meant that companies who had to do due diligence were just able to invest in companies because if they were in the West Bank because there was no red flag, right? And so in this moment, the things that I'm looking for, and post the conversation last summer and sort of seeing what's happening since October 7th, the things that I'm looking for is sort of like, do we have, like, as far as anti-BDS legislation, as far as sort of movements here, as far as sort of more awareness around, being on the right side of history and really sort of thinking about this, and what I said to you again, I know it's boring and it's very about the money and the companies and stuff like that, but it's very important just because it's how things work, and again, sort of what Susan's saying, to make it more expensive, to invest in companies that are located in the West Bank and profiting from settlements and profiting from atrocities and genocide. I just will throw that out there as far as sort of this moment and what can potentially happen. And I will say, just because it's the methodology of the organization where I work, we always, the conversations between, the expertise that needs to be, cross-pollinated at the moment is between, Global South and Global South, like the expertise is lived experience and really understanding how these things work in terms of Congo, in terms of Cambodia, in terms of Sudan. Like these are countries that have survived genocide. They understand, accountability, litigation on behalf of victims of genocide. There's immense expertise, and I think that this will cross over into efforts elsewhere, as well as taking, as future efforts, whether it's through international law, whether it's through domestic law, whether it's through complaint mechanisms, whatever. I think that we have a lot to learn from each other.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Somebody who's engaged in what we like to call the joint struggle, I think there's always crossover between movements, and this notion of accountability keeps reoccurring, and a lot of us don't necessarily really believe in the means of law, whether it's local, domestic, national, international. So I guess as a last question, and because We really do have a protest to get to. But as a last question, in terms of accountability with the ICJ, for example, not really having enforcement capabilities, and it really just being, in many ways, something that changes public opinion and discourse, which is definitely very good. We talked a little bit about Israelis themselves who are very gleeful, and like individuals in the United States and Americans who have subscribed to the Zionist ideology. For many organizers, I guess another thing we're looking at are non-legal means of accountability, and how do we hold not just the state as an entity accountable, but all those who are complicit.
And what does accountability mean in the permanence of genocide? That's something that I've been thinking about constantly. It's like the destruction of an entire city is gone forever, no matter if we rebuild it or not. I don't know if there's an answer, but just want to get some reflections from you.
Yeah. I'll just quickly, my work with communities who have survived genocide, accountability is a very broad term, and what it means is subjective for the individual involved. I think that one very moving way of is an accurate historical record. Is really remembering these stories, sharing the story, sharing the evidence, sharing and having some way of being able to tell that story forever, and not letting it sort of disappear with time. And I think that is it's a very important mechanism of accountability. But again, it's such a broad term. As I said in the beginning, some people view it as a day in court. Some people view it as an outcome, a court decision. Some people view it as, I want compensation for what my family has suffered, and I want it in the form of money. That's also accountability, And so there's, but we get into the transitional justice and what is that, and the steps that need to be taken in order to do that. But it really does start with preserving history. Maybe I'll pass it to the historian.
I think your comment about the permanence of genocide. I mean, there's nothing. There's nothing to say about this, right? I mean, there's always there's this framework of lessons of the Holocaust, for example, which is very, very problematic in various ways. But in general, I mean, what is there to learn from genocide? Nothing at all, right? It's a destruction of a people, of a culture, of a society, of relationships, of futures, right? Of potentials, and that's permanent. That's final, as you said, right? I mean, and we see this in all cases, right? I mean, when I think about what I study, right, the destruction of the Yiddish-speaking Jewish world in Eastern Europe, right, that's gone. It'll never come back, right? And so there's, I think there's this trying to deal with both of it. So there's that, and then there's what happens with the living, with the survivors, with the struggle moving forward. So in terms of, I'll just say that again, I think that because we're witnessing the end of, there's a lot of impunity in the international legal system, I think, not just Israel, but Israel is so foundational, and because we're now seeing a significant crack, and the struggle is to widen it into, right, then this is also then a potential to think about the struggle against other forms of impunity in the international legal system. Again, maybe to change the international legal system in some way. Again, it's all, I mean, after World War II, the system was built on reproducing, right, the state system, white supremacy, all not actually challenging what led us to World War II and the Holocaust, right, but reproducing this world. And the international legal system became part of that reproduction, right? So maybe this is an opportunity to for a change that really requires imagination. It requires action, but it has to be driven with some, imagination. That then is indeed very difficult sometimes to do with the permanence of destruction. But I'll just say one more thing that I hope will happen as a result of the ICJ case and the CCR, and that we might see much more lawsuits around the world on universal jurisdiction regarding genocide against individuals. Now, again, you know, many individuals, never from the West, right? Or not many, but a good number have stood trial, right, for international crimes, also in the International Criminal Court, and that hasn't prevented mass atrocities and mass violence and genocide and so on and so forth. But again, this is Israel and Israelis, right? So I think that beyond the issue of just, you know, people actually having individual accountability as well, which is very limited, right, when we think about systems and structures. But again, because it's the case of Israel, because it's this foundational aspect of the international legal system, and really of the identity of the West, right, in this sense, then I hope that we'll see much more universal jurisdiction in cases brought against Israeli war criminals, and that might also have some kind of an impact.
So I'm glad, Nada, that you brought up, and also what you brought up about Morningstar, because it speaks to all the systems that are propping Israel up in this country in particular. I mean, you have, what we all saw happen at Penn in response to the Palestine rights, the criminalization even of SJP and other Palestine solidarity groups, and even like the New York Times and running a story of mass rape that, you know, that such shoddy, if not fraudulent, journalism that has had, you know, just the media's willingness to parrot whatever Israel tells it to parrot, from 40 beheaded babies to mass rape to burned bodies and whatnot. So this is U.S. media and Hollywood are part of this whole, you know, ancillary system propping up this genocide, and I think that needs to be addressed and talked about and targeted as well in lawsuits, in our activism. In terms of accountability, I wholeheartedly agree with you about the historic record, and truth and narrative as a novelist, as a writer, is something that I deal with in my professional life, and I think it's hugely important. We have a model of what accountability looks like for the Jewish Holocaust. But I think it's deeply problematic in that it exceptionalized that genocide. And it created, and together again with all of these ancillary systems, including Hollywood, that made this dark moment in human history the singular worst moment ever. And I think, you know, you mentioned the Herero and Namakwa peoples. Here in this country, we have the Mafa. You know, we have 400 years of buying and selling and kidnapping and torturing and just terrorizing wholesale and unbelievable horrors against African, kidnapped Africans. And we have the genocide against indigenous Americans. Most of us, you know, we know this sort of, it's in the abstract. We know the broad brush strokes, right? This was bad and this happened. But none of us, this country, does not know the details. We don't have Schindler's Lists and Sophie's Choices or any of these things that apply to the Cherokee Nation or the Iroquois. And this happened here on this soil. Much less, you know, what King Leopold did to the Congolese, making that whole country his personal fiefdom, systematic mutilation. But going back to, you know, what I said about this sort of global South rebellion. When Germany decided, announced that it was going to join the ICJ case on, in support of Israel, Namibia's president immediately said, "Who the hell do you think you are? Do you remember the Herero? The Herero people and the Nama peoples? It was, and again, this is like Germany as a part of this Western colonial empire exists in this arrogant bubble that doesn't even consider the agency of Namibians or their suffering. And so I think the model of accountability that we saw applied for European Jews is something to begin with, but I don't think it's a model necessarily to follow because of the way that it exceptionalized that suffering at the expense of everyone else, and because of the way it was ultimately used to colonize us and destroy our society. In the immediate future, accountability is acknowledgement of our indigeneity, of our belonging to that land. It is a rebuilding of what has been destroyed. And and again, like I like the idea of Nakba studies, but again, I don't like the exceptionalization because it does, and then it begins to, cast shadows on so many other, so much other suffering that's happening in the world. And I think this really, honestly, it should be a whole field of study of accountability, of human accountability, and what that looks like. And it's certainly not something that remains in the courts, and it has to be society-wide. Accountability is for peoples everywhere to be taught critical thinking skills. So we're not in this moment again. It's shocking to me how, I hear all these, and I'm going to stop in a minute, but I just had this really upsetting conversation with a liberal who, right, like, she was telling me, she's a really nice person and I like her, but she was talking about how we have to make sure that Biden wins. I'm like, who, do you know who you're talking to, And she said, well, I understand why you wouldn't vote. I'm like, well, why are you voting for him? And I think this inability that keep, distilling everything down to these electoral politics, and the inability to think critically, the inability to challenge power, the unwillingness to challenge it, the unwillingness to be defiant, or all of these are societal changes that have to happen. So the accountability has to be granular in schools. It has to be granular in cafes, in social discussions. Politics should not be a taboo topic. It should be the topic every person talks about at the dinner table. I will never understand that part about American culture. Like, I come from, this is all we talk about in our house. It's everything. It's like, everybody has an opinion in my family. And everybody is politically sophisticated, from the taxi driver to the PhD. In other countries, it's just here in this country where it's slightly bizarre. That is part of the accountability in this country. It's changing everything on a granular level, so that we don't arrive at this moment again. But y'all, free Palestine.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Making Worlds. Thank you to our panelists, and hopefully see you at City Hall at 10 minutes. Thank you so much.
I just realized my car might be booted. I hope it's not.